Thanks, Alex. Yes, okay. So, Parathreads. Who's heard of Parathreads? Okay, who knows what Parathreads are? Not so many. I think mostly the people that have already seen this presentation in China. So there's an information asymmetry actually in terms of Polkadot and substrate. Normally it's of course in the West, but in terms of for Parathreads specifically, the information asymmetry works the opposite way. I came up with Parathreads on a random morning in Shanghai when I was thinking about a problem. The problem, as it was like, you know, Parachains are great and everything. You know, lots of people probably have this idea of, you know, making a blockchain and like having it plug into Polkadot. But we have this means of handing out parachain slots. You have to have a slot if you want to deploy your parachain, and we have this auction mechanism by which people can sort of come along and offer up dots for deposit, or Kusamas if you're on Kusama, in order to gain a lease for a period of time for a parachain slot. So this had two issues. The first issue was that you have to have quite a lot of dots potentially. I mean, you have to outbid the market in terms of your dot deposit. Which, you know, some teams, we have ways of trying to ensure that this is as easy as possible. One of the ones is with a crowdfunding module built into Polkadot, Kusama. But still, you know, it may be too much of an ask for some teams. And the second problem is, or the second concern, let's say, is that once this slot is over, there's no guarantee that you will be able to sort of continue in the slot. Now, again, one of the sort of mitigating factors for this is that you get to, suppose you can take a 2-year slot up front. So that's the idea. You can take between 6 months and 2 years when you first bid for your slot lease. And then the idea is that after 6 months' time, you can bid for a continuation of that lease 18 months in advance. Yeah. So you have a long sort of way to go before the slot's not going to be taken off you instantly. It's not like the slot runs out and then you have to instantly win a bid at an auction in order to continue. No, you actually get an 18-month period at most in order to secure your slot's continuation. But still, this wasn't like 100% sort of mitigating of these concerns, I think. And then I started to think of other ways how that we might, sort of manage this. And my mind wandered to the late 90s, or early 90s, on some of the platforms where memory was a little bit like parachain slots. It was a very sort of constrained resource, and you had many different applications vying for usage of this memory. And we sort of had this idea of virtual memory, which also known as paging. It's sort of with the rise of PCs, it became page. I always preferred virtual memory as a term, though. Thought it was much more interesting. And virtual memory, if you're not familiar with it, paging, it just allows you to pretend that you have much more memory than you really do, and instead back the memory up with hard disk space. So you're moving things constantly backwards and forwards. Well, actually, if you're lucky, then not constantly backwards and forwards, but in principle, you can be moving stuff backwards and forwards between hard disk and your actual physical memory. Applications, when they're running, they don't know the difference. And the idea is that the applications they don't all use all of the memory at once, they take turns. Similar thing is the case with like IPC, sorry, not IPC, processors. So if you have many different processes, you'll only have a certain number of hardware threads that your computer can actually execute in parallel. I think mine has 12. That doesn't mean I only have 12 applications running on my machine, right? I have many, probably several hundred at this point. And they all just take it in turns. So there's the idea of like resource sharing. So can we apply this sort of general, what is a very fundamental idea in computer science to Polkadot? And the idea is, indeed, we can. Parathreads are in some sense a shared resource on Parachains. So the idea of Parathreads is that they have the same API as Parachains. They basically are, as far as the user's concerned, they are Parachains. Just in the same way that an application, when it's written, doesn't know whether it will be executing on a real CPU thread or whether it will be, shunted off, suspended elsewhere. Parachains, when you're coding them, there's no difference between, you don't know whether when it's deployed, it will be deployed as a parachain or a parathread. The only difference is one of scheduling, right? And I'll go into that a little bit in a second. So parathreads are interoperable with parachains in the same way. They send messages to parachains, they receive messages from parachains and other parathreads. They are, to all intents and purposes, the same thing. They can even be transmuted. So you can take a parathread and turn it into a parachain. And a parachain, you can turn it back into a parathread. They are the same fundamental thing. They're made out of the same stuff. Now, the difference, however, is one of kind of economics and product. So parathreads can be registered for a fixed fee, right? So in the same way that when you, so actually it's not really in the same way, but when you stick a smart contract on Ethereum or when you launch a transaction on Bitcoin, there is a notion of a fixed fee. Actually, it's not fixed, but we'll ignore the fact it's not fixed. It's fixed in terms of gas, or fixed in terms of bytes, sort of, in Bitcoin. So there is a fixed fee associated with parathread deployment. So it's not like Parachains, where you're auctioning for a slot. You're auctioning to deposit dots for a slot. In this case, probably it'll be maybe 50 dots or something like that, let's say, in order to just stick a parathread on. Once it's on, it lives there, it stays there. There's nothing, you don't have to do anything to maintain it. You don't have to pay any deposit. You don't have to lock anything up. There's no rent. It's done. You just put this deposit down, this fixed deposit down, and then you're done. It stays there. Polkadot maintains it. Parathreads only when they're there, they're kind of in a sleeping state. They're not doing anything, right? In order to make them do something, like in order to make them process data, process information, process a block, then you have to they have to pay for their way. So similarly, in Ethereum, when you've got a smart contract deployed, it doesn't do anything unless someone transacts with it. It's kind of the same here. Parathreads just sort of sit idle in the background until someone, for whatever reason, and I'll go into what the reasons may be, pays some dots, in which point they kind of wake up and do something and then go back to sleep again. A little bit like sort of processes and threads, sort of waking up, being executed for a bit on a hardware thread, and then going back to sleep, being suspended. Now, parathreads are free to optimize when they wake up, right? So there will be, if they were, obviously, economically speaking, if they wake up when everybody else wants to wake up, it's going to be more expensive. Just like on Bitcoin, if you send a transaction when everyone else wants to send a transaction, then, transaction fees go sky high. If, on the other hand, you want to wake up when no one else really wants to use Polkadot or Kusama right now, thank you very much, then it's going to be much cheaper. So let's have a look at what the volume of the relay chain. So the relay chain has volume, in some sense, to process, let's say, I don't know the numbers for sure, because we haven't really done much testing in that regard, but let's say around 100 parachain slots for every block, right? So for every block, we can process of the order of, let's suppose, around 100. Now, some number of these will be taken up with system-level management parachains, right? These are things that the governance of Polkadot or Kusama have decided to stick on, and these are things. These are not chains that have their own token. These are not. They're almost certainly not even chains that have their own team behind them. These are just bits of the Polkadot state transition function that have been offloaded onto a parachain. Because we can do that, right? We can shard. We have the power. So things like system level stuff for governance, for staking, maybe even for managing balances and transfers between balances, they can all go, in principle at least, on their own parachain. That hasn't been implemented yet, but that's something that I've sort of been thinking and talking about, and I think it's something that we can definitely sort of aim to do. Nested relay chains, the sort of deep scaling that Polkadot's ultimately aiming for, are another one of these things that might be sort of just deposited through governance into a sort of fixed permanent position as part of this capacity for doing parachain state transitions. And then similarly, potentially bridge hubs, so hubs of bridges onto other chains may also sort of fall into this thing. So these are chains that are providing critical common good things for Polkadot. They're not benefiting any individual or any team specifically. They're really just part of the Polkadot functionality. Then we have the leased slots. So these are what we understand by parachain slots, right? So a team has come along, they've managed to raise a bunch of DOT tokens, maybe through a crowdfund, who knows, and they are leasing a slot in order to put their parachain, their code, plug it into Polkadot and have Polkadot sort of look after the security and the connectivity and whatnot. So we can imagine there's probably a few dozen of those in our 100 slots. And then finally we have a pool of Parathreads. So this is capacity that's spare, that's not yet been used, not yet been accounted for. There's nothing permanently taking up these slots. And what we do is we dynamically select from our set of candidate parathreads every block which one will get given a slot, right? How do we do it? Well, of course, we do it with an auction. So let's have a quick example. Suppose we are on block number 42. Then we have a bunch of collators. So all of the parathreads, or all the ones that care about having their block be transitioned, making progress, all of their collators come forward and they offer some dots, right? So I've colored them according to which parathread they are from, but they're different collators. In principle, they are different economic actors, right? They have each individually have their own account. They each speak for themselves. Alice and Bob are both on the orange parathread. Alice is offering much more than Bob. Alice is offering 10 dots, whereas Bob is only offering 3. Chaz is on her own there. Dave is green, also on his own. He's offering 8. Even Fred, obviously the blue parathread is doing some stuff because they're offering, you know, by far the most. 23 is what Fred's offering. So the blue parathread we would assume is in a rush. It wants to process a block soon, please. Now then, in the next thing, of course, is to select the top ones, because we are the validator, so it's in our interest to get as much money as possible from these guys, because we get to keep a cut of it, you know. So instantly we go, yep, Fred, we'll have you, and then we're like, oh, Eve's the next one, but we can't have Eve. You can't progress the same parathread twice on the same block, right? Because they wouldn't know which one goes first, so it'd be a pain. So we have to skip Eve. So the next one is Alice, and then we have Dave. So we've chosen our 3 parathreads, and in particular our 3 collators. The collator is important. So normally in parachains, the collator doesn't really matter. All of the collators can kind of put forward a block to the validator. There's other validators to choose which one. There's nothing really inherently different between the collators. The validators might have a preference, but they get to choose. In parathreads, they don't get to choose. In parathreads, the collators bid, and the collators that win, that collator has to be the one that authors the block. They can't be different collators block from the same parathread. That doesn't work. And there's a reason it doesn't work, which I will go into. So they've selected these guys, Alice, Dave, and Fred, and they've noted it down. For the next block, and probably this is going to be relaxed to the next some number of blocks to make networking a bit easier. But for now, for the next block, these guys have the right to produce and have finalized and validated a parathread block for their particular parathread. So Alice, Dave, and Fred come along with their blocks. So there you go. And the validators say, oh, great. We take your block. We realize that it's from you. It's signed by you. We know it's from you. We jam it in the relay chain. And of course, they go off and get validated and finalized. So everyone's happy. So how did the economics work in that case? So we have really, for Alice as a collator, she really needs to, she has to pay these dots, right? She's putting in an offer for having her parathread be scheduled, yeah? And she has to pay some dots to the validator and indeed to the treasury, as we'll see, in order to win this auction and get her thing scheduled. So where these dots come from, Alice isn't going to just pay for them out of her own pocket. Well, she sort of is, but she's going to do it with a particular understanding. Yay, crypto economics. So where is the ultimate source of funds going to come from? Well, we have two ultimate sources of funds. One of them is transaction fees. This parathread is going to be doing, we would hope, useful stuff that is useful for people. Yeah? So what do people do if they get useful things? Well, they pay fees. Transaction fees in our case, because we're a blockchain. So the next block to be transitioned, the next block of Alice, I can't remember, orange parathread, is going to have a bunch of transactions waiting, and they're each going to be paying, probably, we would expect some fees. Now, they might not be paying fees in DOT tokens. Parathreads will probably have their own tokens. So they're going to be paying fees in, let's say, TOCs, parathread tokens. And there'll be a bunch of fees. So let's suppose those are the fees, and they add up to 40 tokens. Now, there's another place that we can get value from, extract value or harvest value in order to push forward a Parathreads state transition. Anyone who has thought a little bit about blockchain economics will realize that, the other place that you can get your money from is by inflating the token base. So most blockchains will inflate their token base in order to pay for validators and whatnot, miners. So this is no different. A parathread, of course, a parachain doesn't have to do this. Parachains already put the deposit in. They get all of this for free. It's only parathreads that we're talking about now. So parathreads, may decide that, well, every, I don't know, 15 blocks, we really want to make sure that we author a new one, right? So we want to keep going, but we don't have to keep going every block, but every 15 blocks, we want to make sure we've got at least some one block in. So what it would do is have some sort of curve like this. On the bottom, how many blocks have passed since the last time we got a block in on the relay chain? Yeah? And initially it wouldn't be subsidizing getting blocks in, getting blocks progressed at all. And then eventually when, time started getting on, maybe after 6 blocks have passed or something, it's like, maybe it's time to start subsidizing a little bit. Yeah? So we give them like a couple of tokens. We pay the notional collator a couple of tokens. And as time goes on and on, the graph eventually goes up, and we offer increasing amounts to try and ensure that this block, this parathread block actually gets mined, authored, finalized, validated, etc. Now let's suppose 12 blocks have passed since the last time we actually had something on the relay chain. So that equates to, on this curve, we'll assume 60 tokens. So together we have, in principle, a total token fund of 100 tokens. Now, importantly, over time, this only goes up, right? So after the previous block, immediately after the previous block, all of the transactions, we would assume, have been processed. So the transaction fees would be 0. And we would assume that we're not going to sponsor, we're not going to subsidize any blocks, initially. So at this point, it would be 0. So basically, we're not offering anything, yeah? And as time goes on, we get increasingly kind of antsy about getting a block on the chain, yeah? So the graph goes up, more transaction fees come in, and eventually we're offering so much that we're outbidding sufficient numbers of other people that this figure will be successful at auction. Okay, so what happens? Well, Oh, we'll switch to Dave. So Dave's the validator. Sorry, Dave's the collator. And Dave has got, Dave sees that, by inspecting the parachain state, Dave knows now that 100 tokens is up for grabs. The parachain through its fee, sorry, the Parathread through its fees and its sponsorship is offering 100 tokens. And part of the Parathreads transition function is to just deposit 100 tokens via the fees and the sponsorship into the account of the collator, of whoever it was that managed to get a block in. Yep. So Dave sees, well, I'm getting 100 tokens. These are not dots, but Dave has an account full of dots on the Polkadot relay chain. So Dave's like, I've got a bunch of dots. How many dots would I pay? How many dots is it really worth me to pay in order to get this sort of honeypot of 100 tokens? So Dave looks at the ticker at the exchange, and Dave sees that the exchange rate is whatever. 100 tokens is maybe worth 6 dots or something. So Dave decides that, 5 dots is probably about right. He wants a bit of profit, right? He's not going to do this for free. But if he offers 5 dots and it goes through, then he'll end up with a dot profit, which he's pretty happy with. So Dave offers 5 dots. Now let's assume Dave wins, because not enough other people offer more than 5 dots in order to get their Parathreads on. Then Dave ends up paying 5 dots out, of which 1 dot would probably go to the relay chain block author, so the validator that chose, so they get a cut to put Dave's, to decide Dave would indeed be the one that wins a transition. And 4 dots to the treasury, because, we like our treasury. And in return, Dave gets 100 tokens from the chain. So Dave makes a profit, the chain gets its block in, and the validator is happy, and the treasury gets a bunch of cash. So basically, everybody is happy. So, migration, what happens? Where do Parathreads fit in? Well, actually, Parathreads are pretty cool, because they fit right in the middle. They fit in the middle of everything. So, Parachains and Parathreads, as I said before, are transmutable. You can move between them. A parachain can turn into a parathread, and a parathread can go back into a parachain. So parathreads provide all of the benefits of parachains. The only difference is scheduling. Parathreads are not scheduled every block. You have to pay per block in order to be scheduled. So it's kind of like pay-as-you-go versus subscription model, mobile phones. Parathreads get partial volume depending on how many blocks you pay for. Parachains get full throughput. Once you're getting towards full throughput on your Parathread, then it's probably not going to make sense to be a Parathread anymore. Just be a parachain. Just put the deposit down, stop paying every block, and get as much throughput as you can manage. But you might also, as a parachain, choose to downgrade, right? You might say, well, I actually don't need to have all of this throughput, and maybe I can do more with the dots that I've deposited as a parachain. Now, we're actually, as part of the pull request that's open for Parathreads, there is a mechanism to allow parachains and Parathreads to swap places with each other. So they can basically say, hey, guy, you've got a parachain slot. I could do with a parachain slot. Like, I'm a Parathread. Let's switch places, and I'll pay you such and such an amount, and I'll take on your deposit. Yeah? So that's possible. And that should facilitate a fairly, at least eventually, a fairly good market in terms of price discovery for how much a parachain is worth that's actually quite dynamic. Now, a Parathread can also move backwards and forwards, in principle, to a bridge chain, because at least, assuming things follow the typical sort of substrate style WASM based state transition function, then you can take something that is a parathread, which has as part of it's really only got 2 things. It's got its head data, which is kind of its current header, and it's got the code, which is its state transition function, right? So it's kind of got the state and the function by which the state can change. So in principle, that can be moved into an isolated chain that's bridged over through a bridge hub into Polkadot. Now, of course, isolated chains don't have any security. You have to provide your own security. So you have to going to be providing your own validator set or whatever. And they have only sort of questionable connectivity, because you're going through a bridge, you don't have the guarantee of co-finalization and co-validity, which means you have to, we're not going to instantly trust messages coming off a bridge chain into Polkadot. Yeah, we're going to wait a little while for the bridge chain to sort of definitely make up its mind that these messages are definitely honest and coming from correct transitions. So there's going to be only a buffered level of connectivity there. You're not going to get instant connectivity. But you do get a bit of an advantage in terms of throughput. With Parathreads and Parachains, you're going to be limited by the throughput that any individual validator can validate. Now, with sort of next gen, next level kind of crypto, CK Snark and stuff, that might relax a little bit. But at least in the current term, bridge chains are probably going to be the way to process loads and loads and loads of transactions quickly if you need to process even more than the parachain would do. Of course, the next thing to do is secured bridges, which kind of combine everything and allow you to do huge amounts of potentially arbitrary throughput. Like if you've got like a special purpose blockchain running on special purpose hardware that will allow you to process, ridiculous amounts of transactions a second, then you can still get security as long as they can be split up into individual smaller blocks that a validator on a parathread or a parachain, or like a proper relay chain validator, can interpret and validate. And if that's the case, then suddenly you can have all of this connectivity, but with, all of this throughput with buffered connectivity, admittedly, but with the security of leveraging the Polkadot network. And in principle, we can move around and swap between all of these relatively easily. Okay, so in summary, Parathreads get you everything that you would get as a parachain on the relay chain. The only thing that's different is the scheduling. When parachains retire, so assuming that they lose their slot, they don't die. Before, they kind of like, the sort of retirement story was pretty messy. It was like, well, you can turn them into maybe an isolated chain, but it's sort of like going to be difficult to coordinate that. Well, now there's a halfway house. Now when they retire, they just retire into Parathreads, yeah? And then they can still continue processing transactions, doing exactly what they did when they were a parachain. It's just that they actually have to pay their way now, right? So in essence, the retirement story is much more graceful. And it need not be a retirement. It could be just a stay of leave. And actually, they're going to come back once they've raised enough to actually afford the deposit for a parachain slot. It means that every team that wants to get a piece of the relay chain can deploy their code on it. Yep. And the teams that turn out to be the ones that raise, sufficient, that have a token that's worth enough, or that have a utility proposition that's going to rake in enough transaction fees, they will be the ones that end up using more of the relay chain's capacity. And that's the way it should be. So it's a much more finer-grained means of resource provision. As I said before, this is like a halfway house. So it's not just a halfway house in terms of retirement, but also in terms of on-ramping. Rather than having this kind of zero to everything transition where you deploy a parachain, you can now initially deploy a parathread, have it sort of scale up, have it live on there, have a sort of run-in period, and then when you're ready, move it onto a parachain, assuming that that ends up happening. And finally, you can have your own economics for your Parathread. So you can pay as you go. You can do your own. You don't have to raise quite so much at the beginning. Cool. That's the Parathreads talk. I hope you're a little bit more enlightened, and I'm happy to answer any questions with the 0 seconds I have left.